In 1991, the music business was sprinting toward whatever felt young, loud, and commercially explosive. Grunge was cracking the mainstream, hip-hop was reshaping cultural language, and MTV had become the gatekeeper everyone wanted to impress. Record labels were hunting for artists who could generate buzz fast, preferably under 30, preferably with an edge that translated into headlines. Meanwhile, Nashville was leaning hard into crossover appeal, dressing country and Christian acts in denim and polish, trying to stretch them into broader markets. In the middle of all that noise, in a place most people couldn't find on a map without help, a quiet and almost invisible decision was made by a man who didn't fit the mold of what the industry considered valuable. Bill Gaither, 55 years old at the time, set up a camera in a rehearsal space in Alexandria, Indiana. No elaborate set, no stylists, no strategic rollout. Around him were gospel singers the industry had already moved past, artists who once filled auditoriums but were now treated like footnotes. He pressed record. What followed didn't look like a calculated business move. It looked like a gathering. But that tape didn't just sell, it multiplied, quietly and persistently, into millions of copies, and the revenue it generated would end up reshaping an entire corner of the music world without most people realizing how or why. To understand what happened there, you have to go back decades earlier, long before cameras and VHS tapes entered the picture. Not to a stage or a studio, but to a classroom. Gaither was a high school English teacher in Indiana, living a life that didn't suggest industry disruption was anywhere in his future. Alongside his wife, Gloria, he wrote songs, gospel songs, that didn't fit the commercial expectations of the early 1960s. They submitted those songs, and like many before them, they were rejected. The gospel industry at the time wasn't interested in unknown writers experimenting outside proven formulas. It rewarded familiarity, not risk. Gaither didn't have leverage, connections, or a track record. So, instead of waiting for approval, he made a decision that seemed small at the time but carried long-term consequences. In 1961, he created his own publishing company, not as a side project, but as a structural move. It ensured that every song he and Gloria wrote belonged to them entirely. No label could dictate terms. No external publisher could control access. At that moment, there wasn't much to protect, no major catalog, no steady income, but the framework was there, waiting for the moment it would matter. That moment came gradually. By the late 1960s, songs like "He Touched Me" began to break through into wider recognition. A Grammy nomination followed in 1969, then a win in 1974. The Bill Gaither Trio was no longer obscure. They had an audience, credibility, and most importantly, a catalog they fully owned. For many artists, that would have been the point to relax into success, to ride momentum and let the industry machinery handle the rest. But Gaither wasn't looking at what was working, he was studying what was missing. He was paying attention to the gaps. By the 1980s, Christian music was splitting into two clear directions. On one side were artists like Amy Grant and Michael W. Smith, who were pushing toward polished production and mainstream crossover. Their music leaned into pop structures, broader appeal, and radio accessibility. On the other side were the artists who had built the foundation of gospel music decades earlier. Southern gospel quartets, traditional vocal groups, performers who had spent years connecting with audiences in churches and auditoriums. These artists weren't fading because their audience disappeared. They were fading because the industry decided they were no longer worth investing in. Labels stopped signing them. Radio stopped playing them. The system moved on. Gaither noticed something that others overlooked. The audience for those artists hadn't gone anywhere. They were older, yes, but they were deeply loyal. They weren't chasing trends, but they were committed in ways newer audiences often weren't. They would travel long distances for concerts, buy multiple forms of media at once, and return year after year. In modern terms, they represented high lifetime value. The industry had abandoned them because they weren't fashionable, but that didn't make them insignificant. It made them underserved. That realization led to a move that, in hindsight, looks almost too simple to be effective. In 1991, Gaither gathered a group of these sidelined gospel artists in a studio. The session was loosely framed around honoring Jake Hess, who was recovering from heart surgery. There was no elaborate production, no stage design, no attempt to modernize or repackage the sound. The artists sang, talked, laughed, and interacted in a way that felt unfiltered. It didn't resemble a traditional performance. It felt like being in the room. Gaither recorded it and released it on VHS through his own company. At a time when the industry was focused on radio spins and retail distribution, he sold directly to his audience using a mailing list he had spent years building. That list wasn't just a collection of names, it was a direct line of communication, something he owned entirely. He didn't need permission to reach his audience. He already had access. The results were staggering. The first release sold over 1 million copies, then continued climbing. It wasn't driven by traditional marketing channels. It was driven by trust and direct connection. What followed became known as the Homecoming series, which expanded into over 100 video and audio projects across decades. The total revenue generated reached into the hundreds of millions, and because it operated outside traditional label structures, that revenue stayed within Gaither's ecosystem. There were no complicated recoupment structures draining profits, no external corporations taking a significant share. The system was self-sustaining. But the most important part wasn't the revenue. It was how that revenue was used. Unlike traditional labels, which often treat artists like high-risk investments, Gaither's model worked differently. Instead of launching artists through expensive campaigns, he introduced them within an existing, trusted environment. When a new or lesser-known singer appeared in a Homecoming video, they weren't being sold to the audience. They were being welcomed into a space the audience already loved. That context mattered. It meant the audience's trust extended naturally to the new voice. Artists like David Phelps benefited from this structure in a way that would have been difficult to replicate elsewhere. His technical ability was undeniable, but without a platform, his career might have remained limited to session work or regional recognition. Within Gaither's system, he became a known figure across the entire gospel audience. By the time he launched a solo career, the groundwork had already been laid. The same pattern applied to Guy Penrod, whose years within the Gaither vocal band established him as a recognizable presence before he ever stepped out on his own. Mark Lowry followed a similar path, developing a distinct voice and co-writing "Mary, Did You Know?", a song that would go on to be recorded countless times. These weren't isolated successes. They were the result of a system designed to transfer credibility. Gaither didn't just promote artists, he positioned them within a trusted environment where acceptance felt natural rather than forced. But that kind of system also comes with its own dynamics. When one entity controls the platform, the audience, and the infrastructure, it holds significant influence. The homecoming world had a clear aesthetic and theological identity. It favored traditional sounds, direct messaging, and a specific emotional tone. Artists who aligned with that identity thrived. Those who didn't found themselves outside the system, not because of conflict, but because the platform simply wasn't built for them. That distinction matters. Gaither didn't reshape all of Christian music, he built a highly effective ecosystem within a specific lane. And within that lane, he demonstrated something the broader media industry would take decades to fully understand. Ownership of the audience relationship is the most valuable asset. Formats change. Distribution channels evolve. Trends shift. But direct trust between creator and audience remains stable if it's built consistently over time. When streaming disrupted physical media, Gaither's audience didn't disappear. When radio influence declined, his reach remained intact. His system wasn't dependent on external platforms because it was built on direct access and long-term trust. By the time the rest of the industry started talking about direct-to-consumer models and subscriber relationships, he had already been operating that way for decades. Today, Gaither is in his mid-80s. The tours continue. The catalog still sells. The company remains private, headquartered in the same small Indiana town. The artists he helped develop have become established figures, some now building their own platforms and extending the structure he created. What started as a quiet workaround became a lasting infrastructure. The gap Gaither recognized in the early 90s wasn't an accident. It was created by an industry that decided certain audiences and sounds were no longer worth pursuing. That kind of gap doesn't disappear, it shifts. Right now, similar gaps exist across multiple genres and communities where audiences are underserved not because they lack value, but because they don't align with current trends. Somewhere, someone is building within one of those spaces, likely without attention, likely without recognition. It probably doesn't look impressive from the outside. It